The snow had stopped some time before dawn, but the wind still clawed at the world like a starving animal. Out across the white fields, the cottonwoods leaned and groaned, their branches heavy with ice. The horizon was nothing but a dim, colorless smear, where sky and earth bled together. Clara stood on the porch of the rented shack, her arms wrapped tight around herself, her breath a thin ghost that vanished too soon. The boards beneath her feet creaked, old and soft, like the ribs of a dying beast. Behind her, through the cracked door, came the muffled sound of children stirring small, restless bodies, half awake from the cold. She closed her eyes. The silence pressed against her ears until she thought she might break. Once, she had dreamed of this place, open skies, clean air, the kind of quiet that might heal a heart. But dreams had a way of rotting when brought into daylight. The fields were barren, the neighbors distant. The town had looked at her the way towns did, with that practiced mixture of politeness and judgment, as if her name carried a disease. 6 children and no husband. That was all anyone needed to know. She stepped off the porch, boots sinking into the crusted snow. The hem of her dress was stiff with frost, her fingers raw and cracked from the wash basin. The barn squatted a few yards away, its roof bowed, one side caved where the last storm had chewed through it. She went there anyway, because work was the only thing that still made sense. Inside, the smell of hay and damp wood mingled with the ghost of what had once been a life worth something. A wagon wheel leaned against the wall, a pile of broken harness straps beside it. She set to mending what she could, her movements automatic, practiced. She had learned long ago that despair could not survive where hands stayed busy. By mid-morning, a faint trail of smoke rose from the chimney. The children had managed to coax a flame from the meager kindling she'd left them. She felt a pang pride, sorrow, maybe both. They were tougher than they should have to be. Too quiet for their ages. A noise broke the stillness, a low rumble carried by the wind. Clara straightened, listening. Hooves, slow and heavy, drawing nearer. She wiped her hands on her skirt and stepped to the doorway. A man on horseback emerged from the white blur. The animal moved carefully, its breath steaming in great plumes. The rider was bundled in a long coat, the brim of his hat crusted with frost. He guided the horse toward the barn, dismounted, and led it to the post without a word. "Ma'am," he said finally, voice roughened by cold and road dust. Clara said nothing. She watched him remove his gloves, shake off the snow. His eyes were pale, gray as river stone. "I'm looking for the Sutton place," he said. "Old Ben Sutton told me it was west of the ridge, but the storm turned me around." "This was the Sutton place," she said quietly. "He sold it before winter. I'm renting it now." He nodded, glancing toward the sagging roof. Storm did her no favors. "No," she said, "neither did time." He gave a small, crooked smile, then looked out over the land as if seeing something she could not. "You got help out here?" "Only what I brought with me." He studied her, the question behind his eyes unspoken but clear. Why would anyone bring 6 mouths to feed into the middle of nowhere? She turned back to the shadows inside the barn. "You're far from town," he said after a moment. "Roads near impassable. I could fetch supplies for you on my way back." "There's no money," she said, sharper than she meant to, then softer. "But thank you." He nodded again, unoffended. "Name's Eli McCrae," he said. "I run cattle south of here, near the river bend." She did not offer hers. Names had weight, and she had carried hers too long already. When he rode away, the sound of hooves faded into the hush of snow, leaving only the wind and the slow beat of her own heart. She stayed there a long while, staring at the trail he left behind, until it vanished into the white. That night, as the children huddled near the stove and the last of the firewood cracked in the hearth, Clara thought of the stranger's face, the steadiness of it, the quiet way he had spoken. In this land, kindness was rarer than warmth. She did not expect to see him again, but dawn had its own plans. Morning found the world crusted with the brittle shine of hoarfrost, every stalk and fence strand glazed like a thing set aside and forgotten. The stove breathed weakly, a tired animal, and the house breathed with it. Clara laid another split stick on the coals and stood until the ache in her hands dulled to a bearable throb. The children were quiet, the kind of quiet that meant hunger had been taught to wait. She braided the eldest girl's hair with stiff fingers and sent the older two to scavenge windfall along the fence line. The younger ones she kept close, putting them to sorting beans, to counting pebbles in an old jar so they could name the numbers like steps on a road that did not end. By mid-morning she walked the field with a shovel, testing the ground where the drifts lay shallow, searching for a place to bury the scraps that would draw coyotes if left. The iron bit the earth with a dull ring. She pressed her weight onto the worn handle and felt the string of muscles in her back pull hot, then ease. It helped to work until the mind thinned to a single chord. It helped to remember nothing. The sound came again before noon. Hooves, sure and unhurried. She straightened from the shallow trench, breath fogging. The same horse, same hat rim touched with frost, the same steadiness. He led a sorrel pack mare behind him, canvas bundles lashed neat and tight. He lifted a gloved hand in greeting, but his eyes remained careful, as if he approached a wild thing he meant not to startle. "I said there was no money," she said, before the wind died between them. He swung down and kept a respectful space. "You did," he answered. "I brought what I could spare. Flour, salt, a side of bacon, some nails for your roof and a handful of wire." He nudged one bundle with his boot. "A proper axe, too. Handles sound." "I cannot pay you," she said. "You can refuse me," he said, and nodded toward the bone-white sky. "But it is a hard day to let pride win." She felt the sting of that word, not because it was cruel, but because it was true and tender at once. Pride had kept her upright when nothing else would, and pride had kept food from her children's mouths more than once. The little ones stood in the doorway behind her, faces blotted with the pallor of poor sleep. She looked at them, and then at him, and felt a loosening that was not defeat. "You can leave it," she said. "I will find a way." He set the bundles inside the barn, where the air smelled of dust and old hay, then went to the shed and studied the caved roof. He did not ask permission to fetch the ladder. He did not explain his plan. He only moved as if the world made sense to his hands. She watched him measure with his eyes, watched him pry loose the rotten boards and toss them aside with a clean economy that pleased her even as it pricked at something she did not want to name. When he swung the hammer, the sound rang out sharp and orderly, a language of its own. She joined him without speaking, bracing boards, holding the ladder, passing nails, her skirts dragging through snowmelt. Sweat ran cold between her shoulder blades. When he offered the axe, she took it, and the first stroke bit with a sweetness that rattled her teeth. She set her jaw and split the round clean, then another and another, until the pile grew like a small victory at her feet. The children carried armfuls to the porch, solemn and efficient, as if they were handling something holy. They worked until color returned to their faces and the sun slipped its pale shoulder from the cloud. He shared nothing of himself until the roof lay straighter and the day had gentled some. Then, resting with his back to the barn door, he touched the brim of his hat and said, "My mother came to this country with a trunk and a hymn she could not finish. She taught me that a life is built on small keepings, a fence mended, a meal shared, a word kept." Clara kept her eyes on the axe head shining in the weak light. "Words were not kept for me," she said, and the admission felt like the snap of thin ice underfoot. He nodded, as if that made a shape he recognized. "I learned cattle from my grandfather, learned mercy from the horses, learned to sleep lightly and wake gentle. It is a strange schooling, but it keeps me," he said. "I am not here to claim anything, only to stand a day in a place that needs another pair of hands." One of the boys edged forward with the empty bean sack and offered it up shyly. The man tied it to the saddle with a square knot so neat it looked woven. "When the road clears," he said, "I can bring fence staples. You will want them come spring." "You speak as if I will still be here," she said. "You swing an axe as if you will," he answered, and the corner of his mouth creased just enough to be kindness, not mirth. Through the thin walls came the soft, astonished sound of bacon spitting in the pan. The smell moved through the yard in a warm ribbon and gathered the children like a hand. Clara felt her knees ache and her throat tighten. She had forgotten that meat could smell like a memory worth keeping. When he mounted, she gave him her name because it felt right to set it down on the day. "Clara," she said, the word plain as a plank. "Eli," he returned, though she already knew it, and tipped his hat toward the porch where the youngest clutched a stub of biscuit as if it were a prize. He rode away without looking back, and the fading hoofbeats stitched themselves into the day's small mercies. Clara stood long in the yard, the axe warm in her palm, knowing the work was hers again and feeling, for the first time in a season, that the work might hold. The thaw came slow, in shy breaths that did not trust their own warmth. The snow shrank to ragged patches, the earth beneath black and swollen with water. Each morning the world smelled faintly of mud and resurrection. Clara rose before the light, as she always had, though the days now carried a promise that unsettled her in ways she did not speak aloud. Eli began to appear more often. At first, she told herself it was coincidence he passed by on his way to town. He checked the creek that bordered both their lands, but soon she stopped pretending. He brought fence wire, a sack of seed potatoes, a pail of honey that caught the sun like trapped fire. Each time he lingered, and each time the silence between them stretched a little farther before it broke. He taught her how to set a fence post straight and how to listen for the change in the wind that meant rain. She showed him how to make bread without wasting yeast, how to sew a tear so clean it looked born that way. Their words stayed practical, but their glances grew long. It was not the easy talk of youth, but something quieter. Older two lives rubbing against one another until they found the same rhythm. The children watched him with cautious eyes. They had learned too soon how swiftly men could vanish. But Eli never promised, never raised his voice, never brought gifts he could not spare. He fixed the hinge on the door and left the hammer behind. He told the eldest boy about a Mustang colt born wild the previous spring, and said he might come to see it when the weather held. Clara saw the boy's face light in a way she had not seen since before the sickness took their father. At night, when the house slept, Clara sat near the stove and mended clothes under the faint hum of wind. She thought of Eli's hands, rough, careful, capable of both work and mercy, and she felt a trembling she could not name. She scolded herself for foolishness. The world did not forgive women who believed in second chances, yet when dawn came, she found herself looking toward the ridge before she even noticed. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west. The air thickened, the light turned the color of pewter. Eli arrived at the gallop, his horse slick with sweat. "The river's rising," he said. "The lower fence will go if we don't brace it." They worked side by side in the driving rain, boots sinking deep in the churned mud. The water foamed and hissed against the posts, and more than once she felt it tug at her skirts, as if it meant to take her. Eli caught her arm and held fast until she found her footing. They were soaked through, shivering, but the fear that filled her chest was not of drowning. It was of losing the small life she had begun to rebuild. When the storm passed, they stood together beneath the ragged sky, faces streaked with mud, clothes plastered to their skin. The river had swallowed half the fence, but the posts they'd driven together still held. He looked at her then, long and steady, as if he were memorizing her. "You've got more grit than half the men I know," he said softly. She tried to laugh, but it broke halfway. "Grit doesn't fill a table," she said. "No," he answered, "but it builds what lasts." They walked back in silence, their shoulders brushing now and then, and each touch burned through the wet cloth like a confession. At the porch, he paused. The children had lit a lamp, and its light pooled on the floorboards, turning everything gold. "Come in," she said, before she could think better of it. He hesitated, his hat dripping, his eyes searching hers for the meaning behind her words. Then he stepped inside, quiet as dusk. The youngest girl stared up at him, wide-eyed, as he removed his coat and hung it by the door. He knelt to help the boy coax the fire back to life, his big hands gentle around the kindling. The house filled with a smell of smoke and damp wool, and Clara felt something stir deep inside her, something tender and terrible, like hope wearing the mask of fear. That night, after he left, she stood by the window long after the lamp went out. The world outside was dark, the stars drowned by cloud, but the faint smell of rain and smoke clung to her skin. She pressed her hand to the glass, and in the reflection she saw not the widow who had come west to hide, but a woman standing again in her own light. Spring came early that year, with a wind that smelled of thawed earth and wet cedar. The fields that had been colorless for so long began to pulse with a bruised green. tender and unsure of itself. Clara walked them each morning, the hem of her skirt damp with dew, the air trembling with bird song. She did not think of beginnings or endings, only of the quiet rhythm of things surviving. Eli kept coming, sometimes with supplies, sometimes with nothing but time. He helped mend the gate, built a trough from old boards, and showed the boys how to ride bareback without spooking the mare. When the youngest spilled water on his boots, he only laughed and set her on his knee, telling her a story about a stubborn calf that would not cross a creek. Clara watched from the doorway, her heart tight and strange, as if something long locked away was learning to breathe. He spoke little of his own life, only in pieces, and never as if they were meant for sympathy. His wife had died in childbirth 5 years before. The land had nearly broken him after that. He'd stayed on because there was no one left to tell him to quit. Clara listened, her hands motionless in the dishwater, and understood the silence between his words. Loss recognized itself. It needed no translation. By May, the garden began to take root. The potatoes pushed up small green tongues. The beans climbed the poles like they remembered the way. Clara worked until her back burned, and still she found herself humming soft, tuneless, the kind of sound a body makes when it forgets its sorrow for a while. Eli came one evening with a tin pail of milk and a sack of apples that must have cost him dear in town. "I thought the children might like them," he said, his tone awkward, almost shy. "They will," she said. Then after a pause, "And so will I." They ate them outside, the juice running down their wrists, the sky turning amber and rose above the ridge. The children laughed, sticky and wild, and the sound carried across the fields like a hymn. For the first time in years, Clara did not flinch at joy. She let it fill her chest and settle there, trembling but whole. In the days that followed, people in town began to talk. A widow and a rancher, seen together too often, working side by side. She felt the eyes on her when she went for flour or seed, the whispers that trailed her like dust. No rancher would marry a mother with 6 mouths to feed, she overheard once. The words stung more than they should have, because part of her believed them. When she told Eli, he only said, "Let them talk. They've forgotten what it means to build something that isn't easy." But the whispers grew. A letter came from her sister back east, warning her not to throw away her good name for a man with nothing to offer but land and labor. Clara read it once, folded it carefully, and fed it to the stove. "Names don't feed children," she whispered as it burned. Still, doubt crept in like frost returning where it did not belong. What if he tired of the burden? What if pity, not love, had brought him here? One evening, when he arrived to help brand the calves, she met him at the gate with her jaw set hard. "You don't owe me anything, Eli McCrae," she said. "You've done more than most would." He studied her, the lines of his face deep with both exhaustion and patience. "You think I come here from debt? I think you're kind, and I think kindness can turn to duty faster than you mean it to." He took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and said quietly, "If this were duty, I'd have walked away the day I saw how much work you had ahead of you. But I stayed because when you stand in a place that's still fighting to live, it changes you. You're that place, Clara." The words cut through her, clean and deep. She wanted to answer, but found her throat thick with unshed years. He stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "I don't have much to give, but what I have, I'd give twice over if it meant staying." Behind them, the youngest child called her name, the sound thin and insistent, and the moment folded into the day like a secret. He turned, took the branding iron, and went to work without another word. She watched him move through the dust and smoke, the strength in him quiet and sure, and for the first time she believed he might mean it. That night, after the fire died down and the stars came out bright as old nails, she stood on the porch and whispered into the dark, "Let them say what they will." The wind answered soft through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and smoke. In the silence that followed, she knew. The world had told her no man would ever choose her again, but the world, she thought, did not know Eli McCrae. Summer came heavy and bright, pressing the land flat beneath its heat. The air shimmered over the prairie grass, the sky wide and pitiless as a sheet of burnished steel. Every sound carried farther the clatter of a windmill, the distant bawl of a calf, the rhythmic thud of a hammer where Eli worked the corral. Clara rose before dawn, the hem of her skirt brushing the cool dew-slick floorboards as she moved through the house. The children still slept, their limbs tangled in sheets too thin for comfort. She stood a moment watching them, her chest aching with something she could not name, part gratitude, part fear. To love so many at once was to live always half afraid. Outside, the world was waking. The garden steamed faintly under the first light. The smell of wet earth and horse sweat mixed with the sweetness of wild clover. She could see Eli's shape across the yard, stripped to his undershirt, swinging the hammer with a rhythm steady as breath. The sight of him stirred a heat that had nothing to do with the weather. By the time she crossed the field with his breakfast, the sun had climbed, and her dress clung damp to her back. He took the tin plate with a nod, ate in silence, and handed it back. His eyes met hers only briefly, but in that small glance was a weight of understanding. "You've got a crop worth tending this year," he said finally. "The soil's taken to you. Maybe it's only pitying me," she said with a small smile. He set the plate down and looked at her, serious now. "The land doesn't pity. It remembers who keeps it alive." Their days folded together after that. He brought his cattle to graze near her fence, and the children learned to help him mend tack and haul water. The boys followed him everywhere, eager and awkward, while the girls brought him wildflowers that he always pretended to study, as though they were rare and precious things. At night, when the house was quiet, Clara would sit by the open window and listen for the sound of his horses down by the ridge. Sometimes she thought she heard him singing softly to them, a low tune without words. In those hours, when moonlight brushed the field silver, she allowed herself to believe that what they were building slowly, without promises, might last. But nothing stays untouched for long. The trouble began with a letter delivered by wagon from the county seat. A man named Harper, who claimed old Sutton's debt still held against the land, now sought to reclaim it. The deed Clara had bought cheap and desperate was not clean. If she could not pay the balance, the ranch would revert to Harper by autumn. She read the letter 3 times before she could breathe. The ink blurred where her thumb pressed against it. She thought of the children, the garden, the barn roof they'd mended board by board. All of it could vanish before the leaves turned. When Eli came that evening, she handed him the paper without a word. He read it once, jaw tightening. "He's bluffing," he said. "Sutton signed it over fair. I was there. But I have no proof," she said. "And no money to fight him." Eli paced the porch, the boards groaning beneath his boots. "I could lend you enough to hold it off till winter." She shook her head sharply. "I will not owe you. I will not owe any man. It's not a debt if it keeps your children fed. It is if it costs me my name again." He stopped pacing. The look he gave her was not anger, but hurt, raw, and plain. "You think I'd use it against you?" "I think kindness turns to chains when the world goes wrong," she said quietly. "I've worn them before." He turned away, his shoulders rigid beneath the fading light. "You're proud to a fault, Clara. Pride doesn't build fences or win land back." "No," she said, "but it's all that's kept me standing." He left without another word. The sound of his horse faded into the long dusk, leaving the air heavy and hollow. That night, she sat alone on the porch, the letter spread across her knees, the lantern light trembling in the wind. The children slept inside, unaware of the world tilting beneath their feet. Clara stared toward the dark horizon, where the stars hung cold and clear. She whispered to herself, not as prayer but as promise, "I will not lose this place, not again." And somewhere out there, beyond the ridge, Eli McCrae lay awake under the same indifferent stars, his hand resting on his chest, where her words had struck like a nail driven clean through. The next morning broke hard and gray, the kind of light that flattens everything into the same shade of dust. The storm clouds hung low over the plains, heavy with the promise of rain or ruin. Clara rose before the children, her mind already circling the letter folded on the table like a vulture over bone. She moved through the small house with a steady calm that fooled no one, least of all herself. The world outside was still the silence before a reckoning. She pulled on her worn boots, tied her hair back with twine, and hitched the mule to the wagon. By the time the children stirred, she had already stacked the last of the eggs in a crate, and loaded it for town. "Where are you going, Ma?" the eldest boy asked, his voice small but sure. "To see a man about a lie," she said, brushing a hand through his hair. "Mind your brothers. Keep the fire low." She didn't look back. The road to town was a ribbon of mud and stone, still scarred from the spring floods. The sky pressed down in a dull bruise, and the wind carried the smell of distant rain. Clara gripped the reins until her knuckles ached. The mule's hooves struck the ground in slow, stubborn rhythm, the same rhythm that had carried her through every bad year of her life. When she reached the courthouse, her skirt was stiff with dust, her hands raw from the rope. Harper was waiting on the steps, slick hat, polished boots, eyes like coins that had never seen dirt. "Mrs. Latham," he said, his smile the kind that showed no warmth. "I assume you've read my letter." "I've read it," she said. He nodded, the gesture small and satisfied. "Good. Saves us both some breath. I'm willing to be fair. You pay what's owed, or you pack up before harvest." She stood silent a long moment, the wind stirring the edge of her shawl. "You bought a dead man's word," she said finally. "That deed was signed, witnessed, and buried before you knew this land existed." He laughed softly. "Maybe, but without proof, all the law sees is my name on the paper and yours on borrowed time." She took a slow breath, steadying herself. "You'll have to come take it then." For a moment, his smile faltered. He tipped his hat, all civility again, and walked away, his boots clicking sharp against the boards. She watched him go, the sound like a nail sealing her fate. By the time she turned the wagon toward home, the first drops of rain had begun to fall soft, deliberate, the sky's slow mourning. Halfway back, she saw Eli riding hard down the ridge, his coat dark with rain, his face set like stone. He reined in beside her, the horse snorting steam into the cold air. "You went without telling me." There was nothing to say. "There's everything to say," he snapped. "You think you're the only one with something to lose?" She stared at him, stunned by the anger in his voice. "This isn't your fight, Eli." He leaned closer, rain dripping from his hat brim. "It is now. I found the witness book from the sale Sutton's mark, mine beside it. I'll take it to the judge myself." She shook her head. "If they see you there, they'll think you've got claim to the land, too. They'll twist it." "Let them," he said. "I've lived with worse names than thief." She looked away, the road blurred by rain. "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet a long time, the wind snapping his coat. "Because I've been alone long enough to know what it costs. Because I see what you're building, and it deserves to stand." The rain grew harder, rattling against the wagon boards. The mule brayed, restless. Clara felt her throat close, her heart fighting between gratitude and fear. "Eli," she whispered, "if we lose this, if it breaks you." He reached out, his hand rough and warm, closing over hers on the reins. "Then we build it again," he said simply. They rode the rest of the way in silence, the rain drumming steady above them. When they reached the house, the children were at the door, faces bright with worry. Eli helped her down, his palm lingering against hers just a heartbeat longer than it should have. Inside, the fire hissed and popped, smoke curling through the dim air. Clara stood by the hearth, her hands trembling from more than cold. She felt the weight of the day settle on her shoulders, the debt, the threat, the man beside her who had chosen to stay when he had no reason to. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains, slow and deep, like the earth drawing breath. In that sound, something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, sharp and alive, but it no longer ruled her. She turned to him, her voice low but steady. "All right," she said, "we fight." Eli's eyes softened, the faintest smile touching his mouth. "Then we fight." And for the first time in a long while, Clara felt something that was not despair or hunger or duty. It was belief fragile as a new sprout breaking through hard ground. The days that followed carried the slow, smoldering weight of midsummer. The heat sat on the valley like a sentence. The air shimmered above the grass. The earth cracked and smelled of dust and salt. Yet beneath that stillness, something moved, a will, a pulse that would not quit. Eli returned the next morning with the ledger wrapped in oiled cloth. He laid it on the table beside the letter that had started it all. The book was old, pages yellowed, the handwriting cramped and careful. Clara traced the marks with her finger. Benjamin Sutton, Eli McCrae, Clara Latham. Proof that her life had not been bought with lies. She lifted her eyes to him. If this doesn't hold, Harper will come himself. Then he'll find both of us waiting, Eli said. They spent that day fixing the fence by the north pasture, where the land rose into the first low hills. The children worked alongside them, silent but alert. Even the youngest seemed to feel the air tightening with the promise of a reckoning. Each hammer strike sounded like a heartbeat, echoing through the brittle heat. That night, after the sun fell and the insects began their long metallic hum, Clara found Eli sitting by the well, hat tipped low, a lantern at his side. She sat beside him without speaking. The glow from the lamp caught his face, softening the hard lines worn there by years of wind and solitude. "You ever think," he said quietly, "how strange it is that the worst things make us find each other?" She considered that, her fingers tightening around the rough edge of her skirt. "Maybe that's the only way we do." They sat in silence after that, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of memory, of things almost spoken. The lantern hissed as the flame guttered, and the night seemed to lean closer. When Harper came, he didn't come with words first. He came with men. It was 3 days later, the sun not yet high. Clara was in the garden when she heard the horses. She stood, shading her eyes, watching the dust rise along the road. Eli appeared from the barn, rifle in hand, his face unreadable. Harper rode in front, 2 ranch hands behind him. He swung down easy, like a man sure of his ground. "I gave you time, Mrs. Latham," he said. "Time's gone." Clara stepped forward, her hands steady even as her pulse thrashed. "You've no claim here. The deed's signed, witnessed, and recorded." He smiled, that same slick, practiced smile. "Paper burns easy." Before she could answer, Eli stepped between them, the rifle lowered but ready. "You'll ride off now," he said, voice low and calm. "You'll take your men and your talk, and you won't come back." Harper's gaze slid toward him. "You playing her hero, McCrae? You think the county judge will care what you say?" Eli reached into his coat and pulled out the ledger, flipping it open to the marked page. "This says he'll have to." Harper leaned close enough to read, his jaw tightening. Old Ben Sutton was drunk when he signed that. He'd have sold the land to a ghost for a half bottle of whiskey. "Maybe," Eli said, "but a drunk man's hand still counts in ink." For a long moment no one moved. The wind shifted, carrying the dry scent of grass and sweat. Harper's men looked uneasy, their horses stamping. Then Harper spat into the dust and turned to mount. "This isn't done," he said. "It is if you're smart," Eli replied. Harper hesitated, then swung into the saddle and rode off without looking back. The others followed, their shapes dissolving into the haze. Clara exhaled slowly, her knees weak beneath her. The rifle slipped from Eli's grip, the barrel sinking into the dirt. Neither spoke. The only sound was the wind pushing through the wheat. When she finally met his eyes, something broke loose inside her, a dam of all the words she'd never said. Gratitude, fear, the ache of wanting to believe. "You shouldn't have risked this," she whispered. "He'll come again." "Then I'll be here again," Eli said. "You're not alone in this, Clara, not anymore." The sun slid lower, washing everything in amber and dust. The children came running from the house, their laughter small and wild, a sound too bright for the day's darkness. Eli smiled faintly at them, then back at her. "Let the land see we're still standing," he said. That night, after the work was done and the children were asleep, Clara stepped outside. The sky was enormous, thick with stars, the wind cool for the first time in weeks. Eli stood by the fence, hat in hand. She walked to him slowly, her heart hammering with a courage she didn't yet trust. "I used to think love was a thing that left," she said quietly. "Now I think maybe it's what stays when everything else is gone." He looked at her for a long moment, then reached out and brushed the dirt from her cheek with the back of his hand. "Then we'll stay," he said. "That's all the promise I know how to make." The night closed around them still, vast, forgiving. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote called, lonely and beautiful. Clara turned toward the house, toward the warm lamplight flickering through the windows, and for the first time in years, the word home felt real again. Autumn arrived like a mercy. The heat gave way to wind that carried the scent of dry leaves and wood smoke. The land, weary and scarred from summer's fury, softened into golds and russets, the hills whispering under the slow-turning sky. The harvest came good, better than Clara had dared to hope. The potatoes grew fat, the beans thick on the vine, the children laughing as they gathered them into baskets that filled the porch in a single afternoon. Eli stayed through it all. There was no talk of his leaving now. It had become an unspoken fact that his place was here. He mended fences in the morning, taught the boys to drive nails straight, to shoe a horse without fear. In the evenings, he sat on the porch steps with the youngest asleep against his chest, his eyes distant but peaceful. Sometimes he'd hum an old tune from the trail low, unhurried, the kind of sound that settled into a person and stayed there. The townsfolk, of course, had not gone silent. Some whispered that he was living in sin, others that she had trapped him with need. But neither he nor Clara paid them mind. Words could not touch what had been built in sweat and stubbornness. The land knew better than they did. One afternoon, when the air smelled of cut hay and the sun burned thin through the clouds, Eli rode into town to settle what was left with the judge. Harper had not returned since that morning in summer. The ledger, once challenged, now sat in the county records, a quiet, legal proof of what the two of them already knew. The land was hers. He came back at dusk, dust on his coat and a small folded paper in his hand. He handed it to her wordlessly. It was the deed, her name, clear and steady in the corner. She stared at it a long while before the tears came, slow and soundless, falling onto the wood table like drops of rain on dry ground. Eli looked away, giving her the grace of silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was rough but steady. "You could have kept it in your name. Would have made sense." He shook his head. "It never was mine to keep. This land belongs to the ones who won't run." That night, the house was quiet except for the creak of settling boards. The children slept, the lamp burned low. Clara stood by the doorway, watching Eli as he sat at the table, head bowed over his hat. She crossed the room before she could think better of it, her hands trembling slightly. "You could stay," she said, "if you wanted." He looked up slowly, his eyes soft, with the kind of disbelief that hope brings after too many winters. "You sure?" "I've been sure for a long time," she said. "I just forgot what it felt like." He rose then, the chair scraping lightly against the floor, and stepped close enough that she could smell the faint trace of leather and smoke clinging to his coat. He touched her face like he was still afraid she might vanish. "I'd stay," he said. "Not because of pity. Because because you feel like the end of the road I didn't know I was riding toward." She laughed, a small, broken sound, and leaned her forehead against his. "Then I reckon the road was worth it." The next morning the wind changed. The air carried the edge of winter again, sharp and promising. Together they went out to the field, where frost glimmered on the stubble and the sky stretched clear to forever. The children followed, their laughter ringing across the open space like bells. Eli took her hand not for show, not for courage, but for the quiet fact of it, and they stood there while the sun rose. The land around them gleamed pale gold, and for a moment the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Clara thought of the woman she had been when she first stepped from the wagon into that endless white, hungry hollow affray. She thought of the man who had arrived through the snow, who had given her more than kindness, who had stayed. The world had said no rancher would marry a mother with 6 children, but the world, she knew now, had never seen Eli McCrae mend a roof in the cold, or carry a child through the flood, or plant himself beside her in the dust until the roots of their lives tangled and held fast. Later, when the preacher came through on his circuit, they married under the cottonwoods by the creek. The children gathered wildflowers, and the neighbors, curious, half-charmed, stood at a distance. No rings were exchanged, just hands clasped tight, and promises spoken in the plain words of people who knew what vows cost. Afterward, Clara cooked stew thick with potatoes and beans, and Eli lifted the youngest onto his shoulders while the others danced barefoot in the dust. Evening fell, the lanterns flickered to life, and the land, once barren, once cruel, seemed to hum with quiet blessing. As the stars rose, Clara leaned against the doorway and watched her husband laughing with her children, the fields stretching out beyond them like an open page. She felt the slow, deep warmth of belonging fill her chest. The house behind her smelled of bread and wood smoke. The wind came down from the hills, cool and forgiving, and in its breath she heard not the ghosts of loss, but the steady, living sound of a future being written, one heartbeat, one harvest, una enduring promise, atatim.